to our next session. Before that, however, a couple of announcements. To introduce our staff, and you've met them, no doubt. Terry Alden, who is in our staff for programs for Catholic school outreach, and will be the administrative assistant for our new Center for Catholic Education that we're launching this August, and you'll hear a little bit more about that later. Michael Normant, who is a rising senior at Boston College and a history secondary ed major, and so will be a teacher, which is great, and we have lots of them around here, very encouraging. And then Amelia, who is just starting her master's degree in secondary English and came from Trinity University in San Antonio, where she just finished her bachelor's degree. They are available to help you with whatever you need. So please feel free, and they're terrific people, and they're well-informed and patient and generous. One note about cars. If you have a car and staying overnight on campus, that is not a problem at all, but you need to let one of our staff know so that your name and the information about the car will go to the campus police. So we don't want anyone towed overnight. So please contact them. Second brief announcement, there were a series of books and brochures on the table. At the moment, if you could take one for each school, and then if we have some left over, they can be distributed. But we'd like to make sure that people from, that they get spread around enough. So thank you again, and let's move on to our next session. Sister Dale McDonald.
Good morning. Welcome to the session on research in Catholic urban and rural schools. I'm Sister Dale McDonald. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Education Research at NCEA, and among my duties is the preparation of the annual statistical report on schools, staffing, and enrollment that many of you are familiar with. Also on the panel this morning is Dr. Mary Gauthier, who is the Senior Research Associate at CARA, the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Mary is a sociologist by trade, and she focuses on national level and diocesan demographic data. And Mary was the co-author, along with Mark Gray from their office, on the elementary school study that NCEA commissioned last year, Primary Trends and Outlook, which Mary will discuss. And then Father Joseph O'Keefe, who is the Dean of the Lynch School of Education here at Boston College. Father O'Keefe's work has focused largely on Catholic education, and particularly inner city Catholic education. He's written several articles and books on the topic, and is a lecturer on the topic as well. So the three of us will be the panel this morning looking at the numbers. And generally, what we'll do is I will show you what some of the numbers are currently from our database at NCEA. Mary will, referring to the CARA study, which looked at schools for the past 5 years, tell us how we got to where some of these numbers are today. And then Father O'Keefe will focus a little more narrowly, specifically on inner city schools, and offer some suggestions about what we might do about it. So that's generally the focus for this morning. This first indicator is the actual enrollment numbers this year. Elementary schools, secondary schools, and total. And you notice, as far as Bishop Gregory pointed out, and I guess this is not working the way I wanted it to, that most of the, a little more than half of the schools are located in two areas, the Mideast and the Great Lakes. And that will surface again in the next report. But this is what's an interesting picture to look at, the actual picture of where we've been toward the last end of the last half of the last century and where we are now. That at the height of Catholic school enrollment and schooling, we had almost 13,000 schools in 1960. And we see the decline coming down to 2006, where we're now at a little over 7,500 schools. So nationally, we lost about 41% of our schools in that time period, and the elementary school decline was about 39%, and the secondary school was about 50%. Staggering numbers, and some of what's here may also have some embedded data. When you look at the sheer numbers, it looks as if we had lost about 555 schools in the last 6 years. However, those totals, which are aggregates we get from the diocese, also include the schools that opened. So that in reality, we probably lost close to 800 schools, but the number gets fixed because we have, upped a bit because we have the inclusion of the newer schools that have opened. What's also going to be a very telling number next year will be what happens in the Gulf Coast region. We have currently 89 of the schools have opened in Louisiana, but there's another 35 that may never open again. In addition, in some of the areas in Mississippi and Texas, we have schools in alternate facilities that are now trying to reassess whether or not they will be able to go back to their schools and be able to continue, so that the numbers may be more seriously impacted. This year, if they could, schools stayed open even though they combined with other schools or were in alternate facilities and trailers and roller rinks and several other, creative places where they opened the schools. But the other thing I think that's important to look at is that perhaps the actual number of schools is not, and the decline in that is not as dire as it might portend to be if, in fact, we did retain the students from those schools that were closed. And I'll say a bit more about that when we get to the enrollment. The location of the schools 10 years ago, we had 23% of the schools in the rural areas, 34% in the urban, 12% in the inner city, and 31% in the suburban. When we look at the picture today, we see the big decline in the rural schools. We've closed almost 300 schools in that 10-year period rurally. Urban, we closed about 378, and the inner city schools about 150. And sometimes that number blurs between urban and inner city. While we define in our data collection urban as large central cities, and we try to be more specific about inner city with high concentrations of poverty, at times people blend the two. And so generally when I report, I try to show the two together, which gives us some more accurate picture. The types of schools by governance. In 1996, we had the parish schools as 71%, the interparish as 10%, almost 11, the diocesan almost 8, and the private schools almost 10. We see a shift in this period of time where the parish schools have significantly declined, more than 1,000 of them. And some of them also be the rural schools. We can't differentiate, but when we look at some of the patterns from the dioceses, we're looking at the single elementary schools in rural areas that have no places to combine with to be a consolidated regional school. The interparish schools we see have grown almost 4%. That Bishop Gregory referred to, and also the diocesan schools have also grown, where dioceses either had parishes merged schools or the diocese itself took over the schools. So we're looking at parish elementary, inner city rural as our most seriously affected, and that will be most of Mary's talk. Just an interesting highlight, because we get these questions all the time. What's the percentage of religious to lay? In 1960, we were still almost 90, we were 90% religious. Today, we're less than 5% religious and 95% lay colleagues. Looking at the enrollment picture, today we have the 2.3 million, which I referred to earlier. And again, just to back up to that, the most of the enrollment is also concentrated in the Mideast and the Great Lakes. That's where most of the schools are, where most of the schools were. built because of the high concentrations of population, and the students are there as well. The picture of the Catholic school is not as diverse as the population in general, but over the years we have included more Hispanic, Black, Asian, and so on. But the white, it's still more than 2/3 a white population. We have a growing number of people, though, and you notice the multiracial, where we give people the opportunity to indicate if they are more than one race, and we are serving quite a number of those students. The population that's non-Catholic is 13.5. I guess in statistics you could make that 14%. Not reported. That 9,000 number for not reported also includes, does not include the figures from New Orleans. This year we had trouble trying to put these reports together because we could not get very specific data other than the number of schools opened and the number of students in New Orleans. In addition to these figures on the what the student profile looks like, the Title I school population, schools that have Title I services are almost half. There would be a little more than half if I had actual counts for New Orleans. And the lunch program, too, almost half of our schools participate in the federal nutrition programs. So we are serving, despite all of these notions about these elitist Catholic schools, we are serving children of modest and low-income means. The enrollment trends for the 10 years is what's problematic for us as we look at the numbers that in this 10-year period, there has been a little more than 10% decline in the number of students. Again, we see the high concentrations in the Mideast and the Great Lakes, but also in recent years in the Northeast. They've seen that with some school closings, particularly here in the Boston Archdiocese, that as jobs move out and population shifts, we are losing some of those students. And then you see the happy note there with the plus 2.6% for the Sun Belt growth. And some of that, the far west, even though it's a 1.5% loss, some of that is in the large Los Angeles, has areas where they have closed schools, lost students, but the number is picked up by some of the areas in Arizona and Texas where there is some growth, and they're all in that one region. But what's problematic and what Mary will address, the 12 largest dioceses, which are our urban centers, and that's New York, Chicago, Boston, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and so on. The loss there is 21% over the last 5-year period of time. 5 years, lost 21%. There is an accelerated loss of students and schools during the past 5 years. Nationally, that number is at 14%. But if we take out, looking from the 12 largest dioceses, if we extract that out, the national total would be, in the other schools, non-inner city, would be about 11%. Still a precipitous decline in a short period of time. But the good news is that we are opening some schools. We see that particularly in the Sun Belt region, the bars at the far end of the chart. When we see the schools in the Mideast and Great Lakes that have opened over the period of time, some of those are suburban schools, suburban areas within those large urban dioceses, where parents had been content with the good public school academic education and now are starting to question the need for religious values in the education of their children and have been opening schools. Those are in the wealthiest suburban areas. The schools that are opening in our inner cities are primarily those specialized schools that deal with at-risk students, the Cristo Reyes, the San Miguel schools, and nativity schools that are focusing on a small population, serving a small number of students with a very concentrated focus. But nonetheless, I think what the data will show us, and Mary will talk more to it, there is a demand for Catholic education, and we have the problem, as Bishop Gregory talked about, we have schools where there are no people, and we have people, or very few people, and we have people where there are very few schools. And that's something that we need to address as we go forward. So I will turn this over now to Mary.
Thank you, Dale. And thank you for inviting me to be with you here at this National Summit. I'm going to be reading my remarks to you so that I stay on track and so that I stay within the allotted time frame. The study itself was very comprehensive, very large, multifaceted, and I could go on and on and on, but I don't think you want me to. The data I share with you today come from a series of surveys and trend analyses of Catholic elementary education in the United States that was conducted by CARA. The study was sponsored by a grant from the National Catholic Educational Association, and the research focuses on identifying and providing an empirical understanding of enrollment trends in Catholic elementary schools during the 2000 to 2005 period. I'm going to focus my remarks today largely on the trend analysis that points out the primary long-term trends influencing enrollments in Catholic elementary schools, as well as some shorter-term tipping point events that caused these trends to accelerate during this time period. And then I will also highlight a few of the principal differences that distinguish urban, suburban, and rural schools, and how these differences affect school enrollments. The components of this study that CARA conducted was, first of all, a trend analysis of NCAA's databases, the ones that Dale was referring to, of Catholic elementary schools, official Catholic directory data at the diocesan level, and other CARA databases. We also conducted a survey of 176 diocesan superintendents. We surveyed 1,250 Catholic school principals and 750 pastors at parishes with Catholic schools. And then finally, we surveyed over 1,400 Catholic parents of school-aged children. The key findings from the trend analysis were that there are two long-term trends affecting Catholic schools' enrollments that were exacerbated by two other tipping point events that caused an acceleration effect and a consequent drop in enrollments. The two long-term trends involved Catholic migration, first out of the Rust Belt states and into the Sun Belt states, and also from inner city neighborhoods into the surrounding suburbs. And at the same time, younger generations of Catholics have weakened attachments to parish life as measured by Mass attendance, and is referred to by Archbishop Gregory in his talks. Those were the long-term trends, and I'm going to describe those in more detail in a minute, but I want to point out also the two principal tipping point events that happened during the 2000 to 2005 time period. The first was the U.S. Catholic clergy sexual abuse scandal, which was a media event of unprecedented dimension, beginning early in 2002, when the number of public accusations spiked dramatically. The effects of these reports of abuse are twofold. First, some dioceses have had to plan for and deal with large settlement claims or judgments, or the potential for such financial impacts in the future. Preparations have often included reorganizations of some sort and/or an adjustment to budgets. Many reorganizations have included parish and school closings. On a second level, close to 4 in 10 Catholic parents with elementary school-age children who have not enrolled them in a Catholic school said that the allegations impacted their decision not to enroll their children, at least to some extent. Those least affected by the allegations are parents with children already enrolled in a Catholic school. Very few of them indicated anything more than a little concern about the allegations. That was the first tipping point, and then there's a second tipping point that's related to a broader set of financial issues. CARA documented a 10 percentage point decline in the percentage of Catholics who say that they have given to diocesan appeals since early 2002. The polls indicate that many of those who report a decrease in giving have been more affected by personal economic factors than by the sexual abuse crisis. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, the U.S. was in an economic recession that began in 2001 and lasted through 2003. In addition, school leaders note the challenges of increasing costs associated with providing health care and other benefits, energy costs, and costs associated with the maintenance of aging facilities. In fact, costs for benefits have risen at rates well above inflation in recent years. As a result of these and other factors, a number of dioceses have intensified their reorganization plans and have closed parishes and schools that may have been subsidized and supported under different circumstances. So next, let me show you the effect of some of these long-term demographic trends. The long-term trend of Catholic migration out of the Rust Belt states and into the Sun Belt states, and from inner city neighborhoods into the surrounding suburbs that has been occurring for the past several decades has resulted in many Catholic schools that are located in areas of substantially declining population. For example, as Bishop Gregory noted, 80% of the schools that were closed were in the Mideast or the Great Lakes region. And in fact, 55% of all the Catholic elementary schools that are currently in operation are still in those two areas, the Mideast and the Great Lakes. Another example of this migration is, take the county of Wayne County, Michigan. That's where Detroit is located. Wayne County lost more than 300,000 Catholics since 1950. But counties on either side of Wayne County, neighboring Oakland County, gained 250,000 Catholics since 1950. And Macomb County gained 180,000 Catholics. Unfortunately, they didn't bring their schools with them. So 1 in 5 Catholic elementary schools are now located in counties that have had a loss in Catholic population, or very low growth since the 1950s. Those are the counties that are shown here in orange, or tan, or yellow. And if you can see the little black dots there, each of those black dots represents a Catholic elementary school. 23% of the schools are in moderate growth counties, which are shown in light green, and 54% are in high growth counties, which are shown in dark green. The counterweight to school closings during the 2000 to 2005 period is the continued need for waiting lists in many schools, especially those in the South and in the West. You see all the dark green counties in those areas, as well as in New England. Rather than any national decline in demand for Catholic elementary schooling, the net loss of schools occurred in part because too few new campuses were established in areas that have waiting lists. At the same time, this is the other long-term trend, younger generations of Catholics have weakened attachments to parish life as measured by Mass attendance. In 1955, 74% of self-identified Catholics said that they had attended Mass at least once in the last 7 days, when asked by Gallup researchers. In 2004, however, only 45% of self-identified Catholics responded similarly. So even though the Catholic population is nearly doubled between 1955 and 2004, the estimated number of Mass-attending Catholics per parish is nearly identical at about 1,500. Parents who attend Mass at least once a month are more likely than those who attend less regularly than that to enroll a child in a Catholic elementary school. 39% of monthly Mass-attending Catholics enroll a child in Catholic schools, compared to 13% of those who attend less than monthly. Another part of that trend is potential Catholic first-grade enrollments, as measured by baptismal cohorts. This number is also very consistent to that of the 1950s. So you can see by the graph the bulge that took place, the baby boomers who were in elementary schools in the late 50s, 60s. The estimated pool of Catholics ready to begin elementary school in 2004 is very similar to that of 1954. However, the current and emerging geographic centers for these potential students in the 21st century no longer overlaps as well with the Catholic elementary school system that was primarily designed and built in the early 20th century. According to our survey of parents, 23% of those who had children of elementary school age during 2000 to 2005 have enrolled at least one child in a Catholic elementary school. Another 4% attempted to enroll at least one child but could not, most often because either they could not afford the tuition, 76% gave that reason, and or the school had a waiting list. Another 31% gave that reason. These are the primary long-term trends that are affecting Catholic elementary school enrollments and whose effects have been exacerbated by the tipping point effects of both the clergy sexual abuse scandal and the recent financial issues of recent years. Now I want to focus on some of the other important differences between urban, suburban, and rural schools that we found in our research and how those differences impact decisions about Catholic school enrollments. We found that urban schools make up close to half of Catholic elementary schools now. Suburban schools make up about a third, and rural schools make up about a fifth. On average, rural schools and urban schools are older than suburban schools. They have older buildings. Tuition is highest at urban schools and lowest at rural schools. Schools established before 1975 with no new construction have lower tuitions than newer campuses. Schools with more students charge more for tuition. Schools with the least diverse student populations have the lowest tuitions. Enrollments, not surprisingly, are highest at suburban schools, lowest at rural schools, and the pupil-to-teacher ratio is lowest in rural schools. This shows the share of school income, how it's proportionally divided by school location. And what you see there is that urban schools have a greater share of their income from diocesan subsidy. That's the 6% that's in gold at the top of the first bar. Rural schools, by contrast, the last bar, have the largest share of their income from parish subsidies. Both of these sources of income are threatened by current conditions. Urban schools are more likely than suburban or rural schools to say that the number of students needing financial assistance has increased in the last 5 years. According to the survey of school leaders, the schools that cannot rely heavily on tuition and instead must rely on parish and or diocesan subsidies to make their budgets are among the most likely to have been notified of a possible reduction in these subsidies in the future. These are the schools most at risk of closing in the near future. Now, the availability of financial assistance for tuition is widespread. That's the parts of the bar that is shown in maroon here. Widespread, but mostly privately funded. 15% of schools say there is a publicly funded voucher, tax credit, or scholarship program available for parents. And 70% say there's a privately funded voucher, tax credit, or scholarship program. Urban schools are more likely than suburban or rural to have a privately funded voucher or scholarship program. During the last 5 years, the average tuition for the first child enrolled in Catholic elementary schools has increased sharply. 28%, in fact, in nominal dollars, and 17.8% in real dollars if you adjust for inflation, from $2,276 per year to $2,681. In this figure, we demonstrate the relationship between the household income level of Catholic parents and, first, their likelihood of enrolling a child in a Catholic elementary school, that's the dark green bars, and second, the importance that they place on affordable tuition, that's the light green bars. As you can see by looking at the last set of bars, 45% of Catholic parents earning $125,000 or more in household income have enrolled a child, at least one child, in a Catholic elementary school. And as one might expect among parents in this income group, only 25% indicate that an affordable tuition was very important to their decision about whether or not to enroll. The relationship is mirrored in the other income groups, and you can see, for example, that in those parents with a household income of less than $25,000, only 11% say they have enrolled a child in a Catholic elementary school. And among those that have enrolled, 2/3, 67%, say that affordable tuition was very important in their decision about whether to enroll. School leaders, in fact, are most likely to cite tuition costs and insufficient tuition assistance as reasons that parents are dissuaded from sending children to their school. You can see from the graph that tuition and tuition assistance are of greatest concern in inner-city urban schools and only slightly less in non-inner-city, suburban, and rural schools. Only about a quarter of parents who have enrolled or plan to enroll a child in Catholic elementary school cite insufficient tuition assistance as being at least somewhat of a problem in making their decision about Catholic school enrollment. Whereas nearly half of those who have not enrolled a child and do not plan to enroll a child say that this tuition assistance was at least somewhat of a problem. Again, the reports of this study point to the relative importance of income, tuition levels, and the availability of assistance. The most central economic difference between those Catholic parents who choose to enroll a child and those who do not are not necessarily income or the tuition level, but rather the availability of financial assistance from some other source, whether it is the school, parish, or diocese, or some other type of scholarship program or a public or private voucher program. And finally, a word about waiting lists. About 3 in 10 Catholic elementary schools had waiting lists during the 2004-2005 school year, nearly unchanged from 5 years ago. However, the number of children on those waiting lists has declined from an average of 26 in 2000-2001 to 17 in 2004-2005. Newer schools, suburban schools, and those in New England, in the South, East, and in the West and Far West are more likely to have waiting lists and more likely to have comparatively larger numbers of students on those waiting lists. Schools with waiting lists often charge higher tuitions. They have moderately diverse student populations and fewer low-income students. Nearly 4 in 10 schools built after 1975 have a waiting list. Those are the schools in the suburbs, while only 22% of older campuses do. Newer schools also have a higher average number of students on their waiting list. And as shown in the figure, suburban and urban non-inner city schools are more likely than rural and urban inner city schools to have a waiting list and to have larger numbers of students on these lists. In summary, overall, Catholic elementary schools remain healthy. some even to the point of having to turn away students, at least temporarily. However, few, if any, of these campuses operate without needs, and some are dangerously close to closing their doors. Urban, inner city, and rural schools are among the most threatened by current conditions. The 6-year period studied here in part represents a realignment of Catholic elementary schooling to meet changes in the Catholic population that have been occurring for more than 5 decades. In this respect, the future of Catholic elementary schooling remains as strong as it has ever been. As the results of this study indicate, this strength can be further solidified by ensuring the availability of tuition assistance programs for parents, continuing to emphasize the quality religious education provided by Catholic schools, and by building new campuses in emerging Catholic population centers. Thank you. Should be one of those.
I want to, in my presentation, I'm going to focus more closely on inner city Catholic elementary schools. Now, as we've heard, certainly the great legacy of so many of these schools, which historically provided a real possibility of upward mobility. The Catholic population, certainly over the last 200 years in the U.S., and especially with the large influx of immigrants. So certainly the service to European immigrants, moving from poverty to the middle class and beyond, but also moving out geographically of the inner cities and the shifts that Mary were talking about, and that trend certainly continuing. I don't want to belabor the point. So those schools are very successful, but as Dale said, and these are Dale's data, just to look at them graphically, during the 21st century, the kinds of really dramatic threats that these schools are under and the significant number of closures. I want to talk about a study conducted here at Boston College, which really focuses on inner city Catholic elementary schools, looks specifically at that sector of Catholic education. The findings are available in a book published by the NCEA, which I strongly encourage you to purchase. And I want to talk a little bit about that, and I think it presents a profile of these inner city elementary schools and some possibilities of what seems to work, especially when we looked who are the schools that are really bucking the trends, that are surviving despite the environment that has been described to us. The methodology we used, again, this is survey data. One of the difficulties that we had certainly is trying to focus on inner city, and we have some definitional problems there. What is urban, what is inner city, et cetera. So what we tried to do is look at other indicators like poverty indicators and ethnicity indicators and geography to come up with a composite. So we looked at 384 inner city schools across the country, and you can see, at least if you look at the percentages of schools by ethnicity, by race. So for example, 76 of the schools, 19.8%, had over 75% black enrollment. So you can see that they would fit the inner city categorization. Compared to the nation's general pool of Catholic elementary schools in our sample, larger concentrations in the Mid-East, West, and Far West, more schools sponsored by Archdiocesan or diocese than parochial, significantly more non-Catholic students, 25.6%, 4 times as many black professional staff, twice as many Hispanic staff, and twice as many staff who were members of a religious community, which is both financial and mission related, that I'll talk about a bit. 73% of the students aggregate in these schools were members of what would be considered minority groups. So now, we looked at a set of issues that we thought would be helpful to try to understand what is going on within these schools. And you can see the list of various kinds of issues that we looked at, but in a thumbnail way, I guess I like alliteration, but we looked at sustainability through students, staffing, and structure. And the analysis was to look at descriptive analyses to serve as a general reference text, and some of the differences that lead to better decision-making mechanisms as we see it. Let's look at students. So the first S. Remember, we're looking at students, staffing, and structure. I talked a little bit about the ethnicity of students, where the church certainly is providing opportunities to people of color, which is, when we look at demographic trends in the U.S., of course, increasing. We looked at issues related to the population of students in regard to foreign-born students, and especially in the schools that are heavily Latino, and the issue of limited English proficiency and the growing numbers there, which of course has big implications for curriculum and instruction. Some of the family characteristics that we looked at, and again, you can just kind of look over them. I'm not going into great detail, but I think one of the important aspects that we found when we looked at students in the study, very often what one hears in the rather acrimonious debates around government funding is the fact that Catholic schools are populated only by elite students, be it socioeconomic elite, be it educational attainment of parents. And what we found, in fact, that really is not the case. If we look at issues like family structure or socioeconomic status, the number of students free or reduced lunch, living at or below the poverty threshold, who have been homeless at some point, and certainly without health care coverage and those issues. By religion, what we found within our schools obviously is the more diverse religious background of students. And remember, of course, this is the self-described, what principals would describe as the religious background of their students. What we found in general is who are the non-Catholics within Catholic schools. And one of the frustrations that I found is very often the categorizations are Catholic and non-Catholics, as though those who have religious interests and those who do not. And that's really a very false way to look at the reality, because most of the non-Catholics in the schools that we looked at are African American Protestants. And so I think the whole question related to schools that are Christ-centered, teach the gospel, evangelize, the vast majority of students are Christian, certainly. I also think we need to consider in this debate about focusing our resources solely on Catholic children as opposed to non-Catholic children, some of the issues about mass attendance and how Catholic are the Catholic kids. So in this issue of our religious mission, I think we need to go beyond self-described religious labels. Educational aspirations we found very high, which is, I think, at least my psychologist colleagues would tell me that is a very important indicator of long-term educational success. Enrollment and retention, what we found in these schools, now this was before some of the issues, the data were collected 2000-2001 academic year, if you will, before the perfect storm, if you will, of economic trends and of trends related to church scandals, et cetera. But certainly there was some capacity. Final thoughts, I think, why should a diocese or religious community devote scarce resources to provide educational opportunities to non-Catholics or marginal Catholics? And it really depends on one's theological perspective. And one of the things that we tried to do in the book is when we look at a lot of these empirical data, and as NCA does and as CARA does, what does it mean for us as people of faith? What are the theological issues that get raised when we look at the empirical reality? Staffing issues, and as you know, of course, staffing is so key given the fact that you don't have good teachers, you don't have good schools. Staff are overwhelmingly white, and that is an issue certainly that schools face across the nation if the racial and ethnic mismatch between the students who are in schools and the adults who work there, and the importance of things like role models from the culture of a number of the children. And certainly it's no surprise that we have to redouble and more our efforts to diversify those who work within our schools. The professional staff, 80% full-time. One of the things that we found is in terms of teacher certification that 58% were certified, which is quite a difference from the public schools, certainly. More so in the primarily white schools, and of course, when we looked at issues related to student demographics, white and higher level of income go together. I mean, race and poverty are correlated. They are nationally, and they are in this sample too. One of the interesting things, of course, in terms of teacher retention is the white schools where more certified teachers and higher income had a more difficult time retaining teachers. Well, because arguably they had other options to go right into public education. But certainly, I think the overall picture in terms of staffing is a revolving door of younger people. And so when we look at issues related to inner-city Catholic elementary schools, the staffing issues have to be at the top of the list. For those who leave, and this is what principals told us, 20% leave the profession completely. Not surprising, certainly the data. I was Tuesday attending a day-long conference looking at Boston Public Schools, which are going through a time of transition with a new superintendent. And there in the Boston Public Schools, they lose 50% of their new teachers after 3 years. So it's a problem that we have, but it's a problem that urban schools have generally. It's important to note that while, by and large, Catholic elementary schools, unlike a number of more affluent schools and public schools, rely on principal, teachers, period. And what we find, certainly in so many schools, that the need for professionals with various areas of expertise that can look at the whole child. And so within these schools, there were nurses, psychologists, speech therapists. You can see the long list of people, but certainly in very tiny numbers, very often on a volunteer basis. And when we think of things like the problems that we just heard about with Mary on tuition dependence, staff who can engage in effective development programs, who can engage in negotiations with government to get grants for kids, et cetera, is key. So we need to think broadly about the staffing. Again, many of them volunteers, but volunteers come and go, and very often you really can't, in some ways, relying on professional volunteer staff, while very important, is to some extent building your house on sand and not on rock for long-term sustained impact of other professionals. We looked at principals, and one finding that I just want to raise in regard to the principals is how many of them were women religious in their 50s and their 60s, highly educated, highly experienced, who worked for stipends. Who's going to replace them? And so that was an interesting issue, and especially, and I suppose Mary could tell us something about the demographics of women religious, but certainly you put that together with who was in these inner city schools, and it's quite stunning. And here you just can see this graph, principals and teachers by status within the church. Primarily, of course, the teachers, like teachers in schools generally, like in Catholic schools, are 78% lay women, but if you look at 40% of the principals of these schools were religious sisters. And that's one of the points that I certainly wanted to make in terms of the staffing issues. Let me look at structure for a minute, and certainly one of the issues in school reform that we look at, the need for accountability, the importance of providing evidence of successful schooling, the need to restructure to meet the diverse educational needs of children and families, possibilities and looking at pedagogical innovation in many ways. What we found is that these schools are remarkably traditional, and there are some good parts to that, but there are some parts that aren't very good too. We need to also pay attention to looking not only at teaching and learning, but the barriers to teaching and learning, and deal with those non-academic issues that are so potent in providing in barriers for children to really succeed. And the other thing too, I think we need to think about when we look at location of schools, again, where the population is and where the schools are, and we look at our Catholic population as it shifts. But I suggest we also have to think about the importance of having schools as anchors to neighborhoods and communities. Obviously, schools exist for the students who are within them, but very often what we found when we did a geographical analysis of where these schools are, they're very often in neighborhoods where not only has the Catholic population left, but intact institutions have gone too. The importance of being a presence in those areas. The schools, same kind of findings about the age of the schools, and certainly even when we look at struggles to get through operating budget year to year, there are enormous capital costs that are looming. Now, many urban public school districts, the same story, but they have, with government funding, much better capability to respond to that. We did report an increase in non-tuition income in a number of these schools, and that was a very important thing. We asked some trend data of the principals, and clearly for the future of these inner-city elementary schools, it is really, along with creative leadership, along with meeting non-academic needs, along with demonstrating educational effectiveness through assessment measures that aren't punitive but that are constructive, we also have to say non-tuition income is crucial, and stable non-tuition income. Instructional practices, certainly we've seen the growth of early childhood education, the importance of that in providing. That's really where the bigger numbers are, and we're seeing that anecdotally in a number of places, and our data showed the same thing. Extended programs also, that what we know is for effective schools, it's no longer simply the traditional school day. It doesn't meet the needs of families. It doesn't meet the needs of kids. And don't we know so much more about academic effectiveness depending upon summers, preschool, after-school programs, etc. Some of the curricular practices, we were interested in looking at issues like, for example, English language learners, bilingual education, immersion, the importance of community service learning. And when we get to issues related to the ethos of these Catholic schools, the contribution that they make to the common good, elementary schools engaging in service learning. Partnership with other institutions. Given the fact that many of these schools can't afford the array of professionals to meet with the diverse needs of children and their families, what we found interesting is the number of schools that have formed partnership with institutions. Now, certainly we know when we look at something like Catholic healthcare, Catholic social services, Catholic education coming a bit late to the table, but my Lord, we need to work together. If you're in a parochial school in the inner city and you're really worried about the fact that kids don't have decent health care, that the parents don't have insurance. If there's a Catholic health care network, shouldn't we work together? So when you have scarcity of resources, what you want to do is collaborate. And sadly, so many of these schools and so many of our ministries within the church, just like universities themselves, trust me, people live in silos and don't benefit from one another. So certainly, looking at these partnerships, and that's an area that we would certainly want to follow more. Of course, technology is a major issue in schools. It is a major capital cost, and the importance of technology in a number of the programs, and one of the probes that we certainly would be interested in, because we know anecdotally so much of the technological hardware that these schools have gotten through various kinds of government loans, government grants, have become very fancy, expensive dust collectors. Technology is useless unless you have people who are trained to use technology, to integrate it into learning, to tie it to the assessment of student outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. A lot to do there. Governance structure, changing governance structure, the importance of boards. Again, I can't go into great detail on all of these, but I think when we look at changes, as Archbishop Gregory talked about, the merged schools, new governance models, and we'll be hearing a lot about that in these days. Some final thoughts, I think, for structure, and I've often said this to folks, the great strength of Catholic schools in the U.S. is their autonomy. The great weakness of Catholic schools in the U.S. is their autonomy. The ability to innovate on a level, and that was really why we started SPICE. People need to learn from one another. But certainly I think in these times of threat and difficulty, there is a psychological tendency, unfortunately, to simply retrench and do what we've always done. And one of the things that we found in the schools that buck all the odds, the schools that are servicing all the kind of kids we want to service, is they innovate. They reach out to the local community. They form partnerships. They have innovative staffing structures. It's not same old, because same old means perish. And so I think the message for us is innovate or perish with these schools that are crucial, and we're going to learn a lot from each other about that. Conclusions. The needs, again, I think certainly the legacy of Catholic education, when we look at people like St. Catherine Drexel, there is so much in our tradition. I was talking to the Archbishop as I was driving him back to the Jesuit residence for him to head to the airport. So often I think we look at the current day, and when we look historically, we look back at the heydays of the 60s and the 70s. Now, that might have to do with the age of many of us who are sitting here, but I think really we need to take hope and encouragement if we look back at the founders of many of these institutions. So many Catholic education initiatives failed in the early years. The threats were enormous. There was no guarantee of success. When I think back to Father McElroy, who started Boston College, he was tarred and feathered by the know-nothings. Never could have imagined what we would see as the success of this modern university today. So we have to take heart that we should recapture that pioneering spirit of those who started many of these schools. Certainly in the involvement of everyone, it has to be the entire Catholic community, we've heard that. And I want to end with a quotation, and I think it should really be a theme for our time together. As we look at these empirical data and we ask ourselves, what does it mean to us as people of faith and as Roman Catholics? As you know, Gravissimum Educationis was the decree on education of the Second Vatican Council. And the fathers of the council said this to the church then, and they say the same thing to the church now. We entreat pastors and all the faithful to spare no sacrifice in helping Catholic schools fulfill their function, especially for those who are, number one, poor in the goods of this world, number two, deprived of the assistance and affection of a family, number three, strangers to the gift of faith. Sure, Catholic schools are for the practicing families who are stable, who give to the church, who go to Mass every Sunday. But that's not enough. Whatever we consider, whatever our priorities, we always have to look for the kids who don't come from the kinds of families where they're likely to be raised in faith, to have great opportunities economically, stability of life. We need to really ensure that we follow the dictates and the advice of the fathers of the Vatican Council. As I was saying in an interview yesterday, when I look at the future of inner-city Catholic schools, I am not optimistic, but I am hopeful. So let's that set a tone for us in our deliberations these days.